Sometimes the hardest part of growing older isn't what you've lost. It's what you never got to understand. For 61-year-old Mira Delaney, that weight had followed her for nearly 6 decades. She buys an abandoned cave house in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains for $50, hoping for peace beside a quiet glacial lake. The place is carved right into the cliff, forgotten and weathered by time. She just wants solitude. But beneath the old floorboards, she finds something that stops her cold. Relics that shouldn't be there. Items connected to her father, a miner who vanished without a trace in 1964. Strange sounds echo through the cave at night. A carved stone appears that defies explanation. What started as an escape becomes a reckoning with the past. What really happened to her father all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mira Delaney had spent 30 years learning how to be comfortable with silence. As a backcountry ranger in Montana's wilderness, silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. The rustle of pine needles meant wind direction. The crack of a branch told you what was moving through the forest. The quality of birdsong indicated whether predators were near. She'd learned to read the wilderness, like some people read newspapers, and in doing so, she'd found a kind of peace that most folks spent their whole lives searching for. But retirement had been different. The silence in her Missoula apartment wasn't the productive quiet of the mountains. It was just emptiness. 3 rooms on the second floor of a 1970s building, walls thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the plaster. She'd wake at dawn from habit, make coffee, and sit at her small kitchen table with nothing particular to do. Her body still kept ranger hours, but there was no wilderness to patrol, no trails to maintain, no lost hikers to find. She was 61 years old and felt every year of it in her joints on cold mornings. Her hands were strong but weathered, scarred from decades of outdoor work. Her face had the deep tan lines of someone who'd spent more time under open sky than fluorescent lights. Her hair, more silver than brown now, she kept short and practical. She'd never been one for vanity, and age hadn't changed that. Most days, she'd walk to the library or the coffee shop on Higgins Avenue just to be around people without having to talk to them. She'd built a life around solitude, and now that she had nothing but solitude, she realized it wasn't quite what she'd thought it was. There was a difference between choosing to be alone in the wilderness and being alone because there was nowhere else to be. The dreams had started 6 months after retirement. Always the same one. Her father's face, younger than she'd ever actually known him. He'd disappeared when she was 11, so her memories of him were a child's memories. Big hands, a gentle voice, the smell of pipe tobacco and earth. In the dreams, he was calling to her from somewhere she couldn't quite see. Not words she could make out, just the sense of urgency, the feeling that he needed her to understand something. She'd wake from these dreams with her heart racing, the apartment dark around her, and lie there trying to remember details that would slip away like water through her fingers. Her father, Vincent Delaney, had been a mining surveyor. He'd worked for various companies throughout Montana, assessing mineral deposits, filing reports, spending weeks at a time in remote locations. Her mother had accepted this as the nature of his work. Mira had accepted it because children accept whatever their parents tell them is normal. Until June of 1964, when he left for what was supposed to be a 2-week survey job and never came back. The official story was simple. Vincent Delaney had disappeared in the wilderness. Search parties found no trace. His truck was located at a trailhead, his camping gear gone, but no body was ever recovered. The assumption was that he'd fallen, been taken by wildlife, or suffered some other misfortune in the backcountry. It happened. The mountains took people sometimes, and they didn't always give them back. Mira's mother, already fragile, had deteriorated after that. She died 2 years later from pneumonia, though Mira suspected it was really from a broken heart. Mira had been sent to live with her mother's sister in Billings, a stern woman who believed children should be seen and not heard. She'd raised Mira with duty but not affection, and the day Mira turned 18, she'd left for college and never looked back. She'd become a ranger, partly because she loved the wilderness, but also because some part of her had always believed that if she learned the mountains well enough, she might understand what had happened to her father. She'd spent 3 decades in the places where he might have died, as if proximity to wilderness could somehow close the gap between her and the truth. It never had. The mountains kept their secrets. On a Tuesday in September, Mira had been sorting through boxes of old paperwork from her ranger station days. Most of it was destined for recycling: incident reports, trail maintenance logs, weather data from years past. She'd been about to toss a stack of old wilderness bulletins when something caught her eye. It was a classified section from a bulletin dated 1963, yellowed and brittle. Someone had used it as backing paper in a file folder, probably decades ago, and it had been preserved that way by accident. The classifieds were mostly what you'd expect: used equipment for sale, wanted notices for seasonal workers, land available for lease. But one ad, circled in faded pencil, made her stop breathing. Cave House, Mountain Lake, $50. Inquire for V. DVD. Her father's initials. Vincent Delaney. She'd stared at it for a long time, turning it over in her hands. The bulletin was from 1963, a year before her father disappeared. But someone had circled this ad recently enough that the pencil marks were darker than the aged paper around them. Someone had wanted this noticed. The ad included a phone number. She'd called it, expecting nothing, expecting a disconnected line or someone who'd have no idea what she was talking about. Instead, a land agent had answered. The property, he said, was still available. Had been available for years. Nobody wanted it. Too remote, too much upkeep required, no road access for the last 2 miles. But if she was interested, the price was still $50 for the property transfer. She should have asked more questions. Should have driven out to see it first. Should have done any number of sensible things. But something in her chest had tightened when she heard "still available." And she'd said yes before thinking it through. $50. She'd paid more than that for dinner some nights. She'd signed the papers the land agent emailed over, transferred the money, and received a property deed for a place she'd never seen. Her neighbor in the apartment below had thought she'd lost her mind. "You bought property sight unseen? In the mountains? Mira, that's not like you." But it was like her in a way. She'd spent her whole life making careful, measured decisions. She'd built a career on risk assessment and planning. And where had it gotten her? Alone in a quiet apartment, watching her life run out like sand in an hourglass. This felt like the opposite of that. This felt like the kind of decision her father might have made, impulsive, guided by instinct rather than logic. And the initials in that ad kept circling through her mind. VD. Her father's initials. Inquire for V. D. As if the ad itself had been meant for her, or for him, or for someone who understood what those initials meant. 2 weeks later, she'd loaded her old pickup truck with the essentials. Camping gear, tools, enough food for a month, her old ranger pack with first aid and emergency supplies. She terminated her apartment lease, stored what little furniture she owned, and driven east into the Bitterroot Mountains. The drive took her through Missoula and then south, past Lolo, and into increasingly remote country. The paved highway gave way to gravel roads, which gave way to dirt tracks barely wide enough for her truck. She'd consulted the property maps the land agent had sent, hand-drawn, decades old, barely legible. But her years in the backcountry had taught her how to navigate by landmark and instinct, and she'd found the final turnoff where the agent had indicated. The last 2 miles she'd done on foot, hiking in with her pack, planning to return for supplies once she'd seen what she was dealing with. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through old-growth forest. Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, their trunks thick and ancient. The undergrowth was dense with ferns and huckleberry. A creek ran parallel to the path, its water clear and cold. And then the forest had opened up, and she'd seen it. The lake was small, maybe a quarter-mile across, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the cliff face on the far side. The water was that particular shade of turquoise green you only got from glacial melt, so clear you could see rocks on the bottom 15 feet down. The air smelled of pine and water and stone, but it was the cliff itself that made her stop and stare. Rising from the lake's eastern shore was a limestone formation, weathered and grey, its face pocked with shadow. And built into that cliff, almost invisible unless you knew to look, was the cave house. Someone, decades ago, had found a natural cave in the limestone and built a structure into it. The front of the house was timber, hand-hewn logs, carefully fitted with real glass windows that caught the afternoon light. The roof extended out from the cave mouth, covered in old cedar shakes, some missing, some green with moss. A stone chimney rose from the roof, clearly built from rocks taken from the site itself. The whole structure seemed to grow out of the cliff, as if the mountain had decided to offer shelter, and someone had simply accepted the gift. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, the kind of place that seemed outside of time, forgotten by the modern world. Mira had approached slowly, her ranger instincts assessing the structure. The logs were old but sound, darkened by weather but not rotted. The windows were intact, which surprised her. The small porch that extended from the front door was solid under her weight. Someone had built this to last, and built it well. The door was unlocked. She'd pushed it open, hinges creaking, and stepped inside. The interior was a single large room, maybe 20 feet square. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, built right into the limestone. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the windows. A raised sleeping platform had been built against the back wall, where the cave continued deeper into the mountain. Shelves, mostly empty, lined the walls. The floor was wide plank timber, dusty but intact. Light came through the windows in long slants, illuminating dust motes in the air. The place smelled of old wood and stone, and the particular mustiness of a space that had been closed up for years. But it wasn't unpleasant, just quiet, still. She'd set down her pack and walked the perimeter, examining everything with a ranger's eye. The fireplace showed signs of use, old ash in the hearth. The sleeping platform had remnants of an old mattress, long since deteriorated. The shelves held a few forgotten items, a rusted tin cup, an old kerosene lantern, a wooden box with nothing inside. At the back of the room, where the cave continued into darkness, someone had built a wooden partition wall, turning the rear section into storage or a separate space. She'd need a light to explore back there properly, but standing in that main room, looking out through the windows at the lake beyond, Mira had felt something she hadn't felt in the Missoula apartment. She'd felt at home. This was a place where silence meant something again, where solitude was a choice, not a condition. The mountains surrounded her, close enough to touch, and the lake reflected the sky like a promise. She didn't know why her father's initials had been in that ad, or who had circled them, or what any of it meant. But standing in that cave house, she knew she'd made the right choice. Whatever this was, wherever it led, it was better than sitting in an apartment waiting for nothing. That first night, she'd built a fire in the stone hearth, surprised when it drew perfectly. Whoever had constructed the chimney had known what they were doing. She'd unrolled her sleeping bag on the platform, boiled water for tea, and sat by the fire as darkness fell outside. The sounds were different here than in the high country where she'd worked. The lake lapped gently at the shore. Wind moved through the pines with a softer sound than at higher elevations. And from deeper in the cave, from beyond that partition wall, came the occasional settling sound of rock adjusting to temperature changes, or the whisper of air moving through unseen passages. She'd sat there for hours, watching the fire burn down, thinking about her father, wondering if he'd ever been in this place, wondering what it would mean if he had been. The dreams had been so persistent lately, his face so clear in them. as if he were trying to tell her something across the gap of 60 years and death. Tomorrow she'd explore properly, bring up the rest of her supplies, settle in for real. But tonight she'd simply sat with the strangeness of it all. 61 years old, alone on a mountain, in a cave house she'd bought for $50 because of 2 initials in an old ad. Her whole life, in a way, had been leading to this moment. She just didn't know why yet. The first 3 days, Mira worked on making the cave house livable. She'd hauled supplies up from her truck, food stores, propane for a camping stove, water filtration equipment, batteries and solar panels she'd used during her ranger days. The lake water was clean enough to drink after filtering, and she'd set up a simple gravity system that fed into a barrel near the house. She'd swept out decades of dust, scrubbed the windows until they were clear, repaired a section of porch railing that had rotted through. The work was familiar and satisfying. Physical labor had always helped her think, and there was something meditative about restoring order to a neglected space. But the partition wall at the back of the room had nagged at her. It was clearly newer than the rest of the structure. The wood was less weathered, the construction less careful. Someone had built it as an afterthought, closing off the rear section of the cave. She'd tried the door set into it the first day, found it swollen shut from moisture and age. On the 4th morning, she'd decided to deal with it properly. She'd taken a pry bar from her tools and worked at the doorframe, careful not to damage anything she couldn't repair. The wood was stubborn, but after 20 minutes of patient effort, the door had given way with a groan of protest. The smell that emerged was cool and mineral-rich, the smell of deep stone, untouched by sunlight. She clicked on her headlamp and stepped through. The cave continued back about 30 feet before narrowing to a passage too small to navigate easily. But this section was clearly natural. The walls were limestone, worn smooth by ancient water. The floor uneven stone. Someone had used this space for storage. Old wooden crates were stacked against one wall, most of them empty or containing deteriorated fabric and paper. A few mining tools leaned in a corner, a pick, a shovel, a hand auger, but it was the floor that stopped her. In the main room, someone had laid wooden planks over the natural stone. Back here there were planks too, but they were rougher, less carefully fitted. And in the far corner, near where the cave narrowed, one section of planking sat slightly higher than the rest. She'd knelt beside it, running her hands along the edges. The boards here were loose, not nailed down. She'd worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. The cavity beneath was maybe 2 feet deep, carved into the natural stone, or possibly a natural depression someone had taken advantage of. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it from moisture, was a compass. Mira's hands had shaken as she unwrapped it. The brass was tarnished but intact. The glass face was uncracked, and on the back, engraved in script she'd have recognized anywhere, were the initials VD and a date, June 1964, her father's compass. The one he'd carried on every survey job, the one he'd taught her to use when she was small, sitting on the porch of their old house in Butte, while he showed her how to sight a bearing and read the declination. The one that should have been with him when he disappeared into the wilderness and never came back. She'd sat there on the stone floor, holding the compass in both hands, and felt the world tilt sideways. This wasn't possible. Her father had vanished in June of 1964, and search parties had found no trace of him. His truck at a trailhead 50 miles from here, his camping gear gone, but no body, no evidence, nothing. The assumption had always been that he'd died somewhere in the backcountry, that the wilderness had claimed him the way it claimed people sometimes. But this compass, his compass, had been here, in this cave, hidden beneath the floorboards, which meant he'd been here, in this exact place, and not just passing through, but deliberately hiding something, taking the time to wrap it carefully and conceal it under the floor. She'd lifted the oilcloth out completely and found more beneath. Papers, yellowed but readable. Her father's handwriting. She'd have known it anywhere, that careful engineer's script he'd used for all his notes. Survey calculations, mineral assay results, geological observations. And at the bottom, something that made her breath catch, carved into the stone wall beside the cavity, almost invisible unless you were looking right at it. Were initials VD and SK her father's initials, and someone else's, SK. The letters were rough, clearly done with a knife or sharp tool, but deliberate. Not vandalism, but a record. Two people had been here together, and they'd wanted to mark that fact. Mira had spent the rest of the day searching the cave house inch by inch. She'd examined every surface, looked behind every shelf, checked every corner. And she'd found more marks, subtle things that you'd miss unless you knew to look. Pencil notes on the underside of the table, measurements and calculations. A series of scratches on the stone near the fireplace that might have been a rough map. More initials carved into the wooden frame of the sleeping platform. Every piece of evidence said the same thing. Her father had spent significant time in this place, had worked here, had hidden things here, had marked his presence here. All in June of 1964, the month he'd disappeared. She'd pulled out the property deed the land agent had sent, examined it more carefully than she had before. The land had changed hands several times over the decades. But the earliest notation was from 1963, mineral rights disputed, and beside it, in faded ink, survey required, Bitterroot mineral listed, Bitterroot mineral listed, the company her father had worked for that last year. The company that had sent him on his final survey job. She'd spread everything out on the table as afternoon light slanted through the windows. The compass, her father's notes, the property deed, the ad she'd found with his initials circled. Pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand yet, but pieces that fit together somehow. Her father had been here, working on a mineral survey for disputed property. He'd hidden his compass, left marks and notes, carved initials with someone whose name started with SK, and then he'd disappeared, and the property had been abandoned. And 60 years had passed with the truth buried under floorboards and forgotten, but not entirely forgotten. Someone had circled that ad with her father's initials. Someone had wanted her to find this place. Someone who knew or suspected what had happened here. As evening came on, Mira had built another fire and sat with her father's compass in her hands, turning it over and over. The needle still worked, still pointed true north when she held it level. He'd taken care of this compass, kept it clean and functional, relied on it for his work. And then he'd hidden it here instead of taking it with him. Why would he do that unless he'd known he wouldn't need it anymore? Unless he'd known he wasn't coming back? She'd thought about the last time she'd seen him, a memory she'd replayed 1,000 times over the years. He'd been packing for a trip, loading his truck with the gear he always took, tent, camping stove, surveying equipment, maps. She'd asked if she could come, the way she sometimes did, and he'd knelt down to her level, put his big hands on her shoulders and said, "Not this time, little bear, but I'll bring you something special when I get back." He'd called her Little Bear because she liked to climb trees and dig in the dirt. The nickname had made her feel brave and wild. She'd hugged him goodbye and watched him drive away, not knowing it would be the last time. That night in the cave house, holding his compass, she'd finally let herself ask the question she'd avoided her whole life. What if her father's disappearance hadn't been an accident? What if something else had happened? Something that required hiding evidence, something that required marking a secret location, something that ended with him gone, and the truth buried. The fire had burned low, and the sounds from deep in the cave had seemed louder in the darkness. Not threatening exactly, but present, reminding her that the mountain held more than she could see, that caves went deeper than accessible rooms, that secrets could lie buried for generations. Tomorrow she'd go into town, find the county records office, see what else she could learn about this property and the mineral survey from 1964. But tonight, she'd sat with the compass and let herself feel the weight of possibility. Her father had been here, had left traces for someone to find, maybe for her to find. And after 60 years of not knowing, she finally had a thread to follow. The compass needle pointed north, steady and true, the way it always had. Whatever else had changed, whatever truths were still buried, some things remained constant. She'd spent her life in the mountains, learning to navigate by landmarks and instinct. Now she'd use those same skills to navigate backward through time, to find out what had happened to the man who taught her how to find her way home. The next morning, Mira prepared for a deeper exploration of the cave system. Her ranger training had included basic spelunking, enough to know that caves could be dangerous and that you never went in unprepared. She'd gathered her climbing rope, extra batteries for her headlamp, chalk for marking her path, and her old rescue whistle. If something went wrong, nobody knew she was here, but at least she'd be following proper safety protocols. The partition wall had concealed more than just storage space. At the far end, where she'd found her father's compass, the cave narrowed to a passage about 3 feet wide. She'd noticed it the day before, but hadn't explored further. Now, with proper light and equipment, she'd squeezed through. The passage opened almost immediately into a larger chamber, this one clearly natural and untouched by human modification. Her headlamp beam swept across limestone formations, small stalactites hanging from the ceiling, flowstone on the walls that caught the light and glimmered faintly. The air was cool and still, with that particular quality cave air has, as if it's been the same air for thousands of years. But what caught her attention was evidence that someone had used this space as a work area. In one corner sat a folding camp table, its metal legs rusted but still standing. On the table's surface, held down by rocks, were papers protected in a waterproof case. And against the wall she found tools, geological hammers, sample bags, a portable scale for weighing ore samples. This had been her father's field station. She was certain of it. The setup was exactly the kind of thing he'd have created, efficient and organized, making use of natural shelter to protect his work from weather. She'd seen photographs of his other survey sites, and they'd all had this same practical quality. She'd opened the waterproof case carefully, her hands steady despite the racing of her heart. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her father's meticulous handwriting. Survey notes, dated from May through early June of 1964. Geological observations about the limestone formations, the mineral content of various rock samples, detailed measurements and calculations. But as she'd read through the entries, something else had emerged. This wasn't just a standard survey. Her father had been tracking something specific. He called it the seam in his notes. A mineral deposit that ran through the limestone in a particular formation, accessible from these cave chambers but extending deeper into the mountain. His early entries were excited, professional. Sample 14A shows promising concentrations of rare earth elements, particularly cerium and lanthanum. The seam appears to follow the limestone bed at approximately 15-degree angle, suggesting extensive deposit. He documented his findings with the thoroughness of someone who understood their significance. But as the dates progressed into June, the tone of the entries changed. They became more cautious, more concerned. Additional testing reveals radon concentrations above safety thresholds. Extraction would require extensive ventilation systems, possibly cost-prohibitive. And then, a few entries later, reported findings to company, recommended extreme caution. Response was disappointing. Pressure to minimize risk assessment. Mira had sat on the cave floor, reading by headlamp, and felt the story taking shape. Her father had found something valuable but dangerous, had reported honestly about both the potential and the risks. And someone hadn't wanted to hear about the risks. The final entries in the journal were dated June 14, 1964. Her father's handwriting was still careful, but the content was troubling. They know I'm close to completing the assessment. SK warned me that company representatives have been asking questions, not about the survey, but about my personal reliability. Whether I can be trusted to see the bigger picture. I don't like the implications. SK again. The same initials carved into the cave wall. Someone who'd been working with her father. Someone who'd been concerned enough to warn him. And then, almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the page, if anything happens, the complete documentation is in 3 locations. This site, the company office files. And with JT in Missoula, the truth needs to be preserved. The entry ended there. No further pages in the journal. June 14th, 1964 had been his last written record. Mira had flipped through the remaining pages, finding them blank, except for margin notes written in different ink, clearly added later by someone else. The handwriting was angular and harsh, where her father's had been flowing. Short phrases. He's getting too close. This can't continue. Deal with it. Someone had read her father's journal after he'd written it, had added their own commentary, like they were tracking his progress, monitoring his work. The realization made her skin crawl. Her father had been watched, his private notes violated, his concerns dismissed as he got closer to completing his assessment. She'd photographed every page of the journal with her phone, careful to capture both her father's entries and the margin notes. Whatever had happened here, she needed documentation, needed evidence that couldn't be lost or hidden again. Exploring the rest of the chamber, she'd found more of her father's equipment. Sample bags labeled with dates and locations, most of them empty now, whatever samples they'd contained long since taken or deteriorated. A clipboard with water-damaged forms, barely legible. And tucked into a crack in the limestone wall, another small item wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the cloth was a photograph. Faded color film from the early 1960s, the kind with slightly washed-out tones that made everything look dreamlike. The photo showed 4 men standing at what she recognized as the entrance to this very cave house. They were posed like hunters with a prize, triumphant and confident. Her father was on the left, younger than she remembered him, maybe 35 years old, wearing work clothes and a smile. Beside him stood a man of similar age in overalls, heavy-set with a beard. This must be SK. The other 2 men were dressed differently. One wore work clothes, but looked more like management, clipboard in hand. The other wore a suit jacket despite being in the wilderness, his expression harder than the others, less celebratory. Someone had taken a sharp instrument, probably a knife, and deliberately scratched out the suited man's face. Deep gouges in the photograph, making his features impossible to distinguish. But the rest of the image was intact, and on the back, written in her father's hand, "The Find." May 1964, VD, SK, JR, and the boss. VD, her father, SK, the man in overalls, JR, the one with the clipboard, and the boss, the man whose face had been destroyed. Someone hadn't wanted him identified, had physically removed him from the record while leaving everyone else visible. Mira had studied the photo for a long time. 4 men who'd made a significant discovery, who'd stood together at this cave entrance full of hope or greed or ambition or whatever, drove people to search for wealth in the earth. And within weeks, her father would be gone. The property would be abandoned, and 60 years would pass before anyone looked at this photograph again. She'd continued exploring, finding more evidence of excavation and survey work. Someone had dug test pits in the cave floor, taken core samples, mapped the walls, all systematic, all professional. Her father had been thorough in his work, and whoever SK was, they'd been his partner in it. But the margin notes in the journal kept echoing through her mind. Deal with it. Such a cold phrase, so bureaucratic and clean. As if her father had been a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. As if getting rid of him had been a management decision, filed away in someone's day planner between lunch meetings and conference calls. When she'd finally emerged back into the main room of the cave house, the sunlight through the windows had been startling after the darkness below. She'd stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, thinking about everything she'd found. Her father's journal, describing both a valuable discovery and the dangers involved. His concern about being trusted. His final entry about preserving documentation. The photograph, with its scratched-out face. This wasn't the story of a man who'd gotten lost in the wilderness. This was the story of a man who'd known he was in danger and had tried to leave a trail for someone to follow. Someone who'd eventually come looking for the truth. She'd laid out everything on the table, the compass, the journal, the photograph, and looked at them together. Pieces of a mystery that was starting to take shape. Her father had found something valuable in this cave system, had reported honestly about the risks, had been watched and pressured, and then he'd vanished, and all of this had been buried, but not destroyed, hidden, waiting. as if he'd known that someday someone would come looking. Maybe hoped that someone would be her. The drive to Thornhill took longer than Mira had expected. The mountain roads were worse than she'd remembered, washed out in places from spring runoff, barely maintained. The town itself appeared around a bend in the highway, like something from another era. A single main street with brick buildings from the mining boom days. Half of them vacant now, windows boarded over or broken. This had been a prosperous place once, back when Montana's mineral wealth had drawn people from all over the country. Now it looked like most of those people had left, taking their prosperity with them. The few businesses that remained, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station, had the tired look of enterprises running on momentum and stubbornness rather than profit. The county records office was in the old municipal building, a squat brick structure with limestone trim. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor wax. A single clerk sat behind a wooden counter that probably dated from the 1940s, reading a paperback with a cracked spine. He looked up when Mira entered, and his expression shifted from mild annoyance at being interrupted to something more interested. He was elderly, probably pushing 80, with thick glasses and hands that showed the tremor of age. But his eyes were sharp, and when he spoke, his voice was clear. "Help you find something?" "I'm looking for records on a property in the Bitterroot Range," Mira said. "And information about a mining company that operated here in the 1960s, Bitterroot Mineral Limited." The man's expression changed. Not much, but enough that she noticed. Recognition, maybe, or memory stirring. "That's going back a ways," he said. "I'm Virgil, by the way. Been running this office for 43 years. He set down his book and came to the counter. "What's your interest in Bitterroot Mineral?" "Personal," Mira said. "My father worked for them. He disappeared in 1964 while surveying a property. I'm trying to understand what happened." Virgil studied her for a long moment. "What was your father's name?" "Vincent Delaney." Something shifted in Virgil's face, sadness maybe, or old grief surfacing. "I remember when he went missing," he said quietly. "The whole town was talking about it. Good man, your father. Fair, honest. People trusted him." He paused. "You look like him around the eyes?" Mira felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. I don't have many memories. I was young when it happened." Virgil nodded. "What specifically are you looking for?" "Anything about the property he was surveying. Mineral rights, ownership disputes, company records. Anything that might tell me what he was working on." Virgil was quiet for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Let me pull the files. Going to take a few minutes. Everything from that era is in the basement archives." He disappeared through a door behind the counter, and Mira heard his footsteps descending stairs. She waited, looking around the office. Topographical maps on the walls, yellowed and curling at the edges. Filing cabinets that looked like they'd been there since the Eisenhower administration. A calendar from a local insurance company showing a mountain lake, not unlike the one at her cave house. When Virgil returned, he was carrying 2 filing boxes, dust coating their sides. He set them on the counter with a grunt. "Here's what we've got on Bitterroot Mineral Limited and the disputed property from that period. You can look through them at that table over there." He gestured to a wooden table by the window. "Make copies if you need them. Machines over there, 10 cents a page." Mira carried the boxes to the table and began sorting through the contents. The documents were exactly what she'd hoped to find, a paper trail of the events surrounding her father's final survey. The earliest documents were from 1963. A prospector named Silas Kern had filed a mineral claim on property in the Bitterroot Range, asserting he'd discovered a significant rare earth deposit. The claim had been disputed almost immediately by Bitterroot Mineral Limited, which held adjacent properties and argued that Kern's claim overlapped with their existing rights. Legal documents showed back and forth between lawyers, technical arguments about survey boundaries and mineral bed formations. The language was dense and bureaucratic, but the basic story was clear. Kern claimed he'd found something valuable, and the company wanted it. In May 1964, an agreement had been reached to bring in an independent surveyor to assess both the boundaries and the mineral content. That surveyor was Vincent Delaney. Mira found the contract with her father's signature, his commitment to provide an unbiased technical assessment within 6 weeks. She'd found his preliminary report, dated May 28, 1964. It was technical but clear. Kern's claim was valid. The mineral deposit was present and significant, containing commercially viable concentrations of rare earth elements. And her father had underlined this section, the deposit also showed dangerous levels of radon gas in the rock matrix. Extraction would require extensive safety measures and specialized ventilation systems. The cost would be, in his assessment, prohibitively expensive for current extraction technology. So the minerals were there, but getting them out safely would cost more than they were worth. At least in 1964, the next document was what made Mira's hands shake. Dated June 17, 1964, 3 days after her father's last journal entry, was a transfer of mineral rights. Silas Kern had signed over his entire claim to Bitterroot Mineral Limited for what appeared to be a nominal sum. The signature was shaky, the notary stamp barely visible, as if the whole thing had been done in haste. And then, a week later, the property had been marked unsuitable for mining operations and officially abandoned. All claims released, the site removed from active consideration. She'd flipped through more documents, finding a death certificate that made her breath catch. Silas Kern died June 25, 1964. Cause of death, hunting accident. He'd been found in the woods 3 miles from the disputed property, apparently the victim of a misfire from his own rifle. 2 men connected to this property, her father and Kern, both gone within 2 weeks of each other. One disappeared without a trace, one dead from an accident, and in the space between their deaths, mineral rights had been transferred and the property had been buried in the archives. Find what you're looking for? Virgil had appeared beside the table, making her jump slightly. More than I wanted to, Mira said. She showed him the documents, the mineral rights transfer, Kern's death certificate. This doesn't look like coincidence. Virgil's expression was grim. Never did. There were rumors back then, but nothing anyone could prove. Company had lawyers, money, connections. Kern was just a prospector. And your father was, well, he stopped. Dead, Mira finished. Even though they never found a body. I'm sorry, Virgil said. I liked your father. He came into this office several times during that survey. Always polite, always professional. Last time I saw him was early June. He looked worried, but when I asked if everything was all right, he just said work was complicated. Do you remember anything else? Anything he might have said or done that seemed unusual? Virgil thought for a moment. He asked about the history of the property. Who'd owned it before Kern? How long it had been there? Seemed interested in the cave formations. Asked if there were any old mining records about tunnels or natural passages in that area. Were there? A few mentions from the 1890s, when the first prospectors came through. Nothing detailed, but your father seemed to think the caves might extend deeper than anyone had mapped. Virgil paused, and he asked about one other thing, about the company ownership structure, who the principals were, who had final say on decisions. What did you tell him? That Bitterroot Mineral was majority owned by a silent partner. Name of T. Ashford, never came to town, never showed his face. But he controlled the company's major decisions through proxy votes and a couple of executives on the ground. T. Ashford, the boss mentioned in her father's photograph, the one whose face had been scratched out. Is there anything in these files about Ashford? Mira asked. Not much. Incorporation documents list him as primary investor. That's about it. Virgil went back to the counter and returned with a single page. This is from the original company charter, 1959. Mira read it carefully. T. Ashford, address listed as Helena, Montana. No first name given, just the initial. Capital investment of $500,000, a significant sum in 1959, and a notation that Ashford retained final approval on all major operational decisions. Do you know if anyone else has asked about these records recently? Mira asked. Virgil's expression shifted, something guarded entering it. Funny you should ask. Man came through about 3 weeks ago. Mid-50s, well-dressed, driving an expensive SUV. Asked specifically about the Delaney survey and the Kern property. Paid cash for copies of documents. Didn't give a name. 3 weeks ago. Right around when Mira would have been finding that classified ad in her old Ranger files. What did he look like? Tall, fit, expensive haircut. Had that look people get when they're used to being the most important person in the room. Polite enough, but you could tell he was used to getting his way. Did he say why he was interested? Said he was researching historical mining operations for a book. But he wasn't taking notes like a writer. He was looking for specific information. Knew exactly what documents he wanted. Mira made copies of everything, the mineral rights transfer, her father's survey report, Kern's death certificate, the company incorporation documents. The pile of papers grew, and with it, the shape of what had happened became clearer. Her father had found minerals worth taking but too dangerous to extract profitably. He'd reported that honestly, and someone, probably this T. Ashford, had decided the solution was to eliminate the witnesses and take the rights anyway. Even if the minerals couldn't be extracted then, they'd still have value later if technology improved or prices rose. 2 men had died, rights had been stolen, and the truth had been buried. And now, 60 years later, someone was interested in the property again. The mystery man who'd come to this office, who'd known exactly what to look for. "Thank you," Mira said to Virgil as she gathered her copies. "This helps more than you know. Be careful," Virgil said. "Whatever happened back then, it involved people who were willing to kill to protect their interests. If someone's looking into this again, after all these years, there's probably a reason, and it probably isn't a good one." Mira drove back toward the mountains with the documents on the passenger seat beside her. The sun was setting, painting the peaks gold and pink. Beautiful country. The kind of place that looked peaceful and eternal, as if nothing bad could ever happen here. But she knew better. The mountains kept secrets, and some of those secrets were written in blood. Mira arrived back at the cave house as full darkness settled over the mountains. She'd left a lantern burning in the window, and seeing that small point of light through the trees gave her an unexpected sense of homecoming. 3 weeks in this place, and already it felt more like home than the Missoula apartment ever had. But tonight, something felt different. She couldn't quite place what had changed. Just a sense that the space had been disturbed in her absence. Nothing obvious. The door was still locked, the windows intact. Just an instinct born from 30 years of ranger work, the ability to sense when an environment had been altered. She'd approached cautiously, circling the property before entering. Her headlamp beams swept across the porch, the windows, the tree line beyond. No fresh footprints in the soft earth near the entrance. No signs of forced entry. But the feeling persisted. Inside, everything appeared as she'd left it. Her sleeping bag on the platform, her few possessions organized on the shelves, the fire long since burned to ash in the hearth. She'd set down her bag and the documents from Thornhill, then checked the back cave chamber. The journal was still where she'd left it, her father's compass secure in her jacket pocket, where she'd taken to carrying it, but tucked under the edge of her sleeping bag. Barely visible was a small piece of paper. She'd pulled it out carefully, unfolded it. The message was brief, written in block letters with a cheap ballpoint pen. "Leave while you still can." Her first reaction wasn't fear, it was anger. Someone had been in her home, had violated this space, had thought a simple threat would be enough to drive her away. She'd dealt with worse in her ranger days. Aggressive hikers, territorial hunters, the occasional person running from something and not happy to be found. She'd examined the note more carefully. The paper was ordinary, the kind you could buy at any gas station. The pen strokes were deliberate, pressed hard enough to indent the paper. Whoever had written this wanted to be taken seriously, but didn't want to be identified. Mira had sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, thinking. The mystery man at the county office had been here 3 weeks ago, before she'd even arrived. The note was recent, probably placed today while she was in Thornhill, which meant someone was watching, tracking her movements. Someone who wanted this property clear and was willing to use intimidation to make that happen. But why? The property had been abandoned for 60 years. The minerals her father had documented were valuable but dangerous to extract. Unless technology had changed. Unless what had been impossible in 1964 was now feasible. She'd pulled out her phone, grateful for the weak signal she'd found by standing near the south window. A quick search for rare earth mineral prices showed what she'd suspected. Values had skyrocketed in recent decades. Elements that had been scientific curiosities in 1964 were now critical components in modern electronics, renewable energy systems, advanced manufacturing. What might have been worth thousands then could be worth millions now, and extraction technology had advanced too. Modern mining operations used sophisticated ventilation systems, radon mitigation techniques, remote-operated equipment. What her father had deemed prohibitively expensive 6 decades ago was now standard practice. Someone knew the minerals were still here, knew that extracting them would now be profitable, and they wanted clear access to the property without complications, like an owner who might ask questions or demand fair value. Mira had built a fire and heated water for tea, then sat at the table with all her evidence spread out. The compass, the journal, the photograph, the documents from Thornhill, and now the threat note. She'd arranged them chronologically, trying to see the full picture. May 1964, her father and Silas Kern discover valuable minerals. June 1964, her father reports honestly about extraction risks. Someone, probably T. Ashford, decides to eliminate the complications. Her father disappears on June 15th or 16. On June 17, Kern signs over his rights under duress. On June 25th, Kern dies in a hunting accident. By July, the property is abandoned and forgotten. 60 years pass. Technology improves, mineral prices rise. Someone realizes the old property is now worth pursuing. They research the history, find the connection to Vincent Delaney. They place an ad with his initials, knowing that if his daughter still exists, she might respond. She does, buys the property for $50, and now they're trying to scare her away so they can make their move. But something didn't quite fit. If they wanted the property, why make it available to her in the first place? Why not just acquire it themselves, through the usual channels? She'd gone back to the property deed, reading it more carefully. The ownership chain was complex, passing through several holding companies over the decades. The current owner of record, the one who'd sold it to her, was listed as Mountain Heritage Properties LLC, a shell company, probably designed to obscure the real owners, but the deed also showed something else. There was a notation about disputed mineral rights, still unresolved from 1964. Kern's forced transfer had never been fully validated because his death had interrupted the legal process. The property's surface rights and mineral rights were technically separate, and both were entangled in legal ambiguity, which meant whoever wanted to mine here couldn't just buy the land. They'd need clear title to both surface and mineral rights. And that would require either a lengthy legal process or cooperation from the surface owner, cooperation from her. That's why they'd made the property available. They needed someone to take ownership, someone who'd either sell cheaply when approached or be removed if they proved stubborn. A $50 property wasn't valuable enough to fight over, they'd assumed. An elderly woman living alone in the mountains would be easy to intimidate or buy out. They'd miscalculated. The sounds from deep in the cave had started again, pulling her from her thoughts. Rhythmic and purposeful, like machinery running or tools striking stone. She'd noticed them before but dismissed them as natural cave sounds, water dripping, rocks settling, air moving through unseen passages. But now, listening more carefully, she realized they were too regular, too consistent with human activity. She'd grabbed her headlamp and rope, then entered the back chamber. The sounds were louder here, echoing from the narrow passage at the far end. She'd squeezed through, moving carefully, following the sound deeper into the cave system than she'd gone before. The passage twisted and descended, opening into chambers she hadn't explored yet. And in one of these chambers, she'd found something that stopped her cold. Fresh excavation. New tool marks on the walls. Rock dust that hadn't settled yet, modern equipment, a portable drill, battery-powered work lights, plastic cases for samples. Someone had been mining here recently, probably within the last week. She'd examined the setup more carefully. Professional-grade equipment, carefully positioned. Core samples had been taken from the walls, labeled and organized. Ventilation fans were set up to manage air quality. This wasn't amateur prospecting. This was a systematic, well-funded operation, and it was illegal. This was her property now, and no one had permission to be here, much less to conduct mining operations. She'd taken photographs with her phone, documenting everything. Then she'd continued deeper, following the signs of excavation. The cave system was more extensive than she'd realized, with multiple chambers branching off the main passage. And in the deepest chamber she could access, she'd found the primary seam her father had documented, a visible vein of darker rock running through the limestone, clearly the source of the rare earth minerals. Modern equipment surrounded it. A more sophisticated drill setup, sample analysis equipment, mapping tools. And on a folding table against one wall, she'd found documents, survey maps, assay results, extraction cost projections. Everything was marked with a company logo. Ashford Development Corporation, Ashford, the same name from the 1964 company records. The family that had killed her father was still involved, still profiting from the theft they'd initiated 60 years ago. She'd been examining the documents when she'd heard voices echoing from somewhere in the cave system. Distant but getting closer. People were coming, probably workers checking on the operation. Mira had quickly gathered what evidence she could carry, a few documents, photographs of everything else, and retreated back the way she'd come. She'd made it to the narrow passage and squeezed through just as she'd heard footsteps entering the chamber behind her. Back in the main room of the cave house, heart pounding, she'd secured the door to the back chamber and considered her options. She had evidence now, proof of illegal mining, proof of corporate involvement, proof that this was all connected to her father's death. But she needed more. She needed to know who specifically was behind this, and she needed to stop them before they could cover their tracks the way they had in 1964. The note under her sleeping bag had been meant as a warning. But it told her something important. They didn't know yet that she'd discovered their operation. They thought she was just an old woman who'd stumbled onto a property with a mysterious history. They thought intimidation would be enough. She'd make sure they regretted that assumption. The sound of a vehicle engine woke Mira before dawn. She'd been sleeping lightly, half expecting something like this. Through the window, she watched headlights approach through the trees. Expensive and bright, LED lights, the kind that came on luxury SUVs. She dressed quickly and met whoever it was on the porch, preferring to control the encounter rather than be caught inside. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, stars still visible overhead. Her breath fogged in the cold mountain air. The SUV stopped 20 yards from the cabin. A man emerged, dressed too well for the wilderness in pressed khakis and a fleece jacket that probably cost more than Mira's entire wardrobe. He was mid-50s, fit in the way that suggested gym memberships and personal trainers, with the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of getting what he wanted. "Miss Delaney," he said, approaching with an extended hand. "Roland Ashford. I believe we have things to discuss." Ashford. The name confirmed what she'd suspected. She didn't take his hand, just stood there on the porch, letting the silence stretch uncomfortable. "Let him work for this conversation." Roland lowered his hand, smile faltering slightly. "I apologize for the early hour, but I wanted to catch you before you started your day." "May I come in?" "It's rather cold out here. We can talk on the porch," Mira said. "I don't know you, and I'm not in the habit of inviting strangers inside." "Fair enough." Roland leaned against the porch railing, casual but calculated. "I'll get straight to the point. I've been researching my family's business. History. My grandfather was a silent partner in several mining ventures in this area back in the 1960s. I've recently learned about some troubling events that occurred, including the disappearance of your father. I wanted to reach out personally, to express my condolences, and see if we might find a way to make things right. It was smooth. Mira had to give him that. The tone of concerned grandson, seeking to correct historical wrongs. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, watching her reactions carefully. "How did you find me?" she asked. "The property records. When I was researching the old Kern claim, I noticed it had recently changed hands. The name Delaney caught my attention, and I made some inquiries. Learned you were Vincent Delaney's daughter. It seemed too significant to be coincidence. And what exactly do you think needs to be made right?" Roland shifted his weight, choosing his words. "From what I've been able to piece together, my grandfather was the primary investor in Bitterroot Mineral Limited. The company president, a man named Gordon Hale, was apparently ruthless in his business practices. When your father's survey showed valuable minerals but difficult extraction, Hale decided to eliminate the complications, your father and Silas Kern, and take the mineral rights by force. It was a good story. Blame a dead man, position himself as the reasonable family member seeking redemption." Mira waited, letting him continue. "My grandfather discovered what Hale had done after the fact. He was horrified, but couldn't prove anything, and by then the damage was done. The property was abandoned because extraction wasn't feasible with 1960s technology, and everyone involved tried to forget the whole ugly business. My grandfather carried that guilt for the rest of his life. That's a nice story," Mira said. "Convenient that it blames someone who can't defend himself." Roland's expression tightened. "I have documentation supporting this version of events. But regardless of the specifics, the fact remains that your father died in connection with my family's business interests. I'd like to compensate you for that loss. I'm prepared to offer you $250,000 for this property as a gesture of restorative justice. It's more than fair market value, and it would allow you to—" "Did you leave the note?" Mira interrupted. "What note?" "The one under my sleeping bag yesterday." "Leave while you still can." Roland's surprise looked genuine. "I certainly did not. If someone threatened you, that's unacceptable. Have you reported it to the authorities?" "Not yet. But I did discover something interesting yesterday. There's an illegal mining operation in the caves below this property. Professional equipment, systematic extraction, all without permission from the property owner. That would be me." Roland's mask slipped for just a moment, anger flashing across his face before he controlled it. "I don't know anything about that, really, because the equipment is labeled with your company logo. Ashford Development Corporation." Silence stretched between them. Mira could see him recalculating, trying to decide how to play this. When he spoke again, his tone had changed, harder, more direct. "Let's be honest, Miss Delaney. We both know what's down there. Rare earth minerals worth millions. My family had claim to those minerals 60 years ago, and we're prepared to exercise that claim now. The legal situation is complicated, but I have resources to pursue it through the courts if necessary. However, I'd prefer to handle this amicably. Take the money, relocate somewhere comfortable, and let me develop this site properly. Everyone benefits. Your grandfather murdered my father. You can't prove that. Maybe not yet. But I have my father's survey journal. I have photographs. I have county records showing suspicious transfers and convenient deaths. And now I have evidence of illegal mining on my property. That's enough to start asking uncomfortable questions." Roland pushed off the railing, and his friendly demeanor evaporated completely. "You don't want to make an enemy of me. I have lawyers, resources, connections. I can make your life very difficult if you insist on being stubborn about this. Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact. This is business, Miss Delaney. Your father understood that even if it cost him. Sometimes principle is expensive." Mira stepped down off the porch, moving into Roland's space deliberately. She dealt with men like this before, bullies who mistook courtesy for weakness. "Get off my property. Take your equipment out of my caves. And if I find anyone here again without permission, I'm calling the sheriff and the FBI." "The FBI?" Roland laughed. "For what?" "Interstate fraud, illegal mining, theft of mineral rights, possibly murder conspiracy spanning 60 years. I'm sure they'll find something interesting once they start looking into your family business. Roland's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. I've been making mistakes my whole life. I'm comfortable with it. Mira held his gaze until he looked away first. You have 48 hours to clear your equipment. After that, I document everything and hand it over to federal authorities. Roland walked back to his SUV, then paused with his hand on the door. My offer stands. $250,000. That's more money than you've probably seen in your life. Think about what you're giving up for pride. I'm not giving up anything. I'm taking back what your family stole. He drove away without responding, tires spinning slightly on the soft ground, kicking up dirt and pine needles. Mira watched until his taillights disappeared through the trees, then went back inside. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding her system. She'd effectively declared war on someone with resources, connections, and a family history of eliminating problems. But backing down had never been in her nature. Her father hadn't backed down, even knowing what it might cost him. She could do the same. She'd made coffee and sat at the table, thinking through her next moves. She had evidence, but it was scattered, personal documents, photographs, records from the county office. She needed professional help, people with authority to investigate properly and protect her while they did it. The FBI field office in Missoula seemed like the right place to start. Federal crimes crossed state lines, and the Ashford family business probably did too. If she could get an agent interested, they'd have the resources to dig deep, to uncover connections she couldn't see on her own. But she also needed to find the other evidence her father had mentioned. His journal entry had been clear. Documentation in 3 places. She'd found the cave cache. The company office files would be long gone, probably destroyed when Bitterroot Mineral folded. But the 3rd location, with JT in Missoula, that might still exist, JT Jim Talbot. She'd finally remembered the name late last night, lying in the darkness. One of her father's old friends, someone he'd mentioned when she was small. She had vague memories of him visiting their house a few times, a tall man who'd always brought her peppermints and taught her card tricks. If he was still alive, he'd be ancient. But it was worth trying to find him. If her father had trusted him with documentation, he might still have it, might still be waiting after 60 years. For someone to come asking about Vincent Delaney, she'd packed a bag with copies of everything she'd found, secured the cave house as well as she could, and prepared to make another trip to Missoula. But this time she'd be more careful. Roland knew she was asking questions, and his workers knew their operation had been discovered. They'd be watching, and they'd be trying to figure out how to silence her before she could cause real problems. Her father had faced the same situation. He'd known he was in danger, had documented everything he could, and had tried to ensure the truth would survive, even if he didn't. Now it was her turn to see if she could do better. To see if she could not only preserve the truth, but also live to see it acknowledged. Mira knew she couldn't leave immediately, not after her confrontation with Roland. His workers would be clearing equipment from the caves, and she needed to document everything before they could remove evidence. She'd waited until late morning, watching from the trees, before making her way back into the cave system. The workers were there, just as she'd expected. 2 men in work clothes, systematically dismantling the drilling operation and packing equipment into plastic cases. They hadn't noticed her approach. She'd spent 30 years moving quietly through wilderness, and those skills hadn't faded. She'd taken photographs from concealment, documenting the equipment, the workers' faces, the extent of the excavation, evidence that could prove illegal mining if Roland tried to deny everything. She'd been about to retreat when one of the men's phone had rung, his voice echoing through the stone chamber. "Yeah, Roland, we're pulling out now. The old lady's got the whole setup documented already, so there's no point trying to hide it." A pause. "What about her? You want us to handle it?" Another pause, longer this time. "Understood. We'll be out by tonight." Mira had waited until they'd moved to a different chamber, then quickly made her way deeper into the cave system, following passages she'd mapped in her earlier explorations. She needed to see everything before they removed it, needed to understand the full scope of what they'd been doing down here. the deepest accessible chamber, was where they'd concentrated their efforts. The mineral seam her father had documented was exposed here, and the workers had taken extensive core samples, mapped the formation, analyzed the content. But it was what she'd found, tucked in a crevice at the back of the chamber, that changed everything. A metal box, similar to the one that had held her father's compass, but marked with her name. For Mira Delaney was scratched into the metal surface, her father's handwriting unmistakable even after 60 years. Her hands had trembled as she'd opened it. Inside, sealed in plastic to protect it from moisture, was a letter. She'd pulled it out carefully, unfolding pages that her father had written in the last days of his life. The letter was dated June 15th, 1964, the day after his last journal entry. The day he'd disappeared. "My dearest Mira," it began, and she'd had to stop reading for a moment, tears blurring her vision. His handwriting was so familiar, so achingly present, that it felt like he was speaking directly to her across the gulf of 60 years. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it out. I'm sorry for that, more sorry than I can express. I wanted to watch you grow up, to see the woman you'd become. I wanted to teach you about these mountains, to share with you all the things I've learned. But sometimes life demands we make choices that cost us everything we value. I've discovered something here, minerals valuable enough that men are willing to kill to possess them. I was hired to assess this property honestly, and I did. I reported what I found, rare earth elements in significant quantities, but trapped in rock formations that make extraction dangerous and expensive. With current technology, mining here would risk lives and cost, more than the minerals are worth. But the man who controls Bitterroot, Mineral doesn't want to hear about limitations. T. Ashford. He called me to his office 3 days ago and made his position clear. I could revise my report to minimize the risks, or I could face consequences. When I refused, he made threats against my employment, my reputation, my family. Against you and your mother, I couldn't let him win. Couldn't let corruption triumph just because the price of integrity was high. So I documented everything, made multiple copies of my survey, my findings, the evidence of Ashford's bribery attempts. I've hidden copies in 3 places where they'll be safe, where eventually the truth can come to light. This cave is one of those places. I've worked with Silas Kern to create a record that can't be easily destroyed. Silas knows what we're facing. He's received threats too, demands that he sign over his mineral rights for nothing. We've both chosen to resist, though we both know what that resistance might cost. The second location is the company office files, though I suspect Ashford will purge those once I'm gone. The third is with my dear friend Jim Talbot in Missoula. Jim doesn't know what's in the envelope I gave him, just that it's important, and that someday someone might come asking for it. I trust him to keep that promise. Mira, my little bear, I need you to understand why I'm making this choice. It would be easy to falsify the report, to take Ashford's money, to look the other way and keep my family safe. But that would make me complicit in whatever harm comes from careless extraction here. It would make me part of the corruption instead of someone who stood against it. I want you to grow up knowing that your father was honest. That when faced with a choice between safety and integrity, he chose integrity. Not because I'm brave, I'm terrified right now, but because some things matter more than survival. If you're reading this, you've found your way to this cave. That means you've probably uncovered at least part of what happened here. I hope you'll find the other documentation, piece together the whole story, and know that I died trying to do the right thing. I'm leaving you something else in this box. A property deed. Silas and I have been working with a lawyer to transfer ownership of this land to a trust in your name. It won't be finalized until next week, but Silas has signed preliminary paperwork establishing your claim. If anything happens to us, this property should eventually be yours. Not because of the minerals, but because this place is beautiful and peaceful, and because I spent my final days here thinking about you. I love you more than words can express. I'm proud of you already, even though you're only 11 and I won't see what you become. Be brave, be honest, be kind. Seek truth even when it's difficult. And remember that every choice I made, even the last one, was to give you a world where integrity matters. Your father, always. Mira had sat in that cave chamber, her father's letter in her hands, and wept. Not the quiet tears she'd shed before, but deep body-shaking sobs that came from a lifetime of grief, finally finding release. He'd known he was going to die, had accepted it as the cost of standing firm. And he'd left this for her, a message across time, an explanation she'd needed her whole life. When she could breathe again, she'd examined the rest of the box's contents. There was indeed a property deed, preliminary paperwork showing that Silas Kern had intended to transfer ownership to a trust established for Mira Delaney. The final signatures were missing. Kern had died before completing the process, but the intent was clear. Her father had been trying to give her this place. Not the minerals, but the land itself. The cave house, the lake, the mountains. A refuge, a home, a connection to him even after death. She'd understood then why the classified ad had used her father's initials. Jim Talbot, keeping his promise after 60 years, had eventually tracked down the property and arranged for it to be made available to her. The $50 price tag had been his way of making sure she could afford it, his way of honoring Vincent Delaney's final wish. But she'd also understood something else, something that changed the entire picture. Her father's letter made it clear T. Ashford had ordered the murders. Not Gordon Hale, not some unnamed company president, but Ashford himself. Roland's story about his grandfather discovering the crimes after the fact was a lie. The grandfather had been the architect of those crimes, and now the grandson was continuing the family business of theft and murder. Roland's smooth talk about restorative justice had been manipulation. His offer to buy the property had been an attempt to acquire what his grandfather had tried to steal 60 years ago. And his illegal mining operation was simply a modern version of the same crime, taking what didn't belong to him. Damn the cost to anyone else. She'd been photographing the letter and deed when she'd heard voices again, the workers returning to this chamber. She'd quickly tucked everything back in the box, secured it, and looked for an escape route. The chamber had a narrow passage leading deeper into the mountain, too small for the mining equipment, but possibly navigable by a person. She'd squeezed through, ignoring the tight spaces and rough stone, following the passage as it wound through the limestone. Behind her, she'd heard the workers enter the chamber, heard them discussing how to remove the last of the drilling equipment. The passage had eventually opened into a space she'd never seen before, a natural cathedral in the stone, stalactites hanging from a ceiling 30 feet above, a small underground stream trickling through the center, beautiful and ancient and completely hidden from the world above, and there, carved into the wall near the stream, were 2 more sets of initials, larger and more carefully done than the others, VD and SK. Her father and Silas Kern had found this place together, had marked their presence together. 2 men facing death who'd wanted to leave some record of their partnership in defiance. Mira had stood in that hidden chamber, surrounded by stone and water and silence, and felt the weight of everything she'd learned. Her father hadn't been a victim of random wilderness tragedy. He'd been murdered for refusing to compromise, for choosing integrity over survival. And his murderer's family was still profiting from that crime, still using the same tactics of intimidation and theft. But her father had also left her a path forward. Evidence in 3 locations, a property that was rightfully hers, and most importantly, an example of courage that she could follow. She'd found her way back through the passages to the main cave system, careful to avoid the workers. By the time she'd emerged into her cabin, afternoon light was streaming through the windows, and she'd had a plan. Tomorrow, she'd go to Missoula, find Jim Talbot, collect the final piece of evidence. Then she'd take everything to the FBI and make sure the Ashford family finally paid for 60 years of crime. Roland thought she was just an old woman, easy to intimidate or buy off. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. Her father had died standing up to corruption. She was still alive, still fighting, and she had no intention of backing down. The drive to Missoula the next morning felt different than her previous trips to town. Mira was no longer looking for answers. She was gathering ammunition. Everything she'd found, everything she'd learned, was building toward a confrontation that would finally bring the truth into the light. She'd started with the city directory at the public library, searching for Jim Talbot. The name was listed Talbot J., Mountain View Retirement Community. Her heart had lifted at seeing it. After 60 years, her father's friend was still alive, still in Missoula, still potentially keeping the promise he'd made in June of 1964. The retirement community was on the south side of town, a modern facility with well-maintained grounds and a view of the mountains. The receptionist at the front desk had been cheerful and helpful when Mira asked to see Jim Talbot. "He doesn't get many visitors," the woman had said, checking her computer. "He'll be so pleased. He's in the assisted living wing, room 147. Just sign in here and I'll give you a visitor badge." Mira had followed the directions through carpeted hallways that smelled of cleaning products and institutional food. Room 147's door was open, and inside she'd found an elderly man in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the mountains with the patient stillness of someone who'd learned to measure time differently. He'd turned when she knocked, and his eyes had widened with recognition, even though they'd never met. "You look just like Vincent," he'd said immediately. "I've been waiting for you." Mira had stepped inside, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "You placed the classified ad. You made sure I found the property." Jim had nodded slowly. "Took me years to track down that deed, to figure out how to get the property into your hands without raising suspicions. Had to be patient. Had to wait for the right time." He gestured to a chair beside him. "Sit down. Tell me what you found." She'd spent the next hour telling him everything. The compass under the floorboards, the journal with its margin notes, the county records showing Kern's death and the suspicious transfer of mineral rights, the confrontation with Roland Ashford, the illegal mining operation, and finally, the letter her father had left for her in the deepest cave chamber. Jim had listened with tears running down his weathered face, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement. When she'd finished, he'd been quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the mountains. "Vincent came to see me on June 14th, 1964, Jim had said finally. "Showed up at my house in the evening, looking worried but determined. He gave me an envelope, made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd keep it safe. Said that someday his daughter would need it, and I should make sure she got it when the time was right. Do you still have it?" "Never let it out of my sight for 60 years. Jim had wheeled himself to a small desk in the corner, opened a locked drawer with a key he wore on a chain around his neck, and pulled out a manila envelope. Yellowed with age, but sealed with wax that had never been broken. Mira's hands had shaken as she'd taken it from him. The seal showed her father's initials pressed into the wax. She'd broken it carefully and pulled out the contents. Inside was her father's complete survey report, every finding, every measurement, every analysis. Unaltered, professionally documented, signed and notarized. A perfect record of what he'd discovered and what he'd recommended. The danger ratings were there, clearly stated. The extraction cost estimates were documented. Everything an honest surveyor would include in a comprehensive assessment. But there was also something else, a letter from T. Ashford to Vincent Delaney, dated June 10th, 1964. The letter was typed on company letterhead, and it was as close to a confession as Mira could have hoped to find. "Mr. Delaney," it read, "your preliminary findings regarding the Kern property are noted but not acceptable. The extraction difficulties you've cited are exaggerated and will be addressed through appropriate engineering. Your final report must reflect commercial viability without excessive focus on minor safety concerns. A revised assessment focusing on deposit value and minimizing risk factors will be expected by June 20th. Your cooperation in this matter will be financially rewarded. Your refusal would be extremely unwise. Regards, T. Ashford." It was all there, the pressure to falsify, the implicit threat, the expectation of compliance. Her father had kept this letter as evidence, had understood that Ashford's own words would condemn him. There were also copies of the legal documents establishing the trust for Mira, showing that Silas Kern had intended to transfer the property to her. And a signed statement from Kern himself, dated June 16th, detailing the threats he'd received and expressing his fear that he wouldn't survive to complete the transfer. "Your father knew he was in danger," Jim had said quietly. "He told me as much. But he wouldn't back down. Said some things were worth dying for, and integrity was one of them. I tried to talk him out of it, tried to convince him to just revise the damn report and keep his family safe. But he wouldn't hear it. He did the right thing," Mira had said. "I know, but it cost him everything." Jim had wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. "I kept that envelope for 60 years, waiting for you to show up. I'm 93 years old, and I was starting to think I wouldn't live long enough to keep my promise. But here you are, finally. Vincent would be so proud of you." Mira had taken photographs of everything, then carefully returned the originals to Jim's care. "I need you to keep these safe a little longer. Once I take down the Ashford family, these will be evidence in a federal investigation. But right now, they're safer here with you than anywhere else." Jim had agreed, locking the envelope back in his desk drawer. "What are you going to do? Take everything to the FBI. Prove what happened 60 years ago and what's happening now. Make sure the Ashfords finally pay for their crimes." From Jim's room, Mira had driven to the FBI field office in downtown Missoula. The building was modern and anonymous, the kind of place that could have housed any government agency. Inside, she'd asked to speak with someone about a historical murder case connected to ongoing criminal activity. The agent who'd met with her was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Cho, with sharp eyes and the kind of careful attention that suggested she'd heard a lot of unlikely stories in her career. But as Mira had spread out her evidence, the photographs, the documents, the letter from her father, the proof of illegal mining, Cho's expression had shifted from polite skepticism to genuine interest. "This is 60 years of premeditated fraud," Cho had said, examining the Ashford letter. "And if the illegal mining operation is as extensive as you're describing, we're looking at current federal crimes too. Theft of mineral rights, trespassing, possibly racketeering if we can establish a pattern of similar crimes. The Ashford family has been in the mineral rights business for decades," Mira had said. "I'd be surprised if this was their only questionable acquisition." Cho had made notes, asked detailed questions, taken copies of everything Mira could provide. "I need to brief my supervisor, but I think we'll want to move on this quickly. Can you show us the cave system and the mining operation? The workers were pulling out yesterday, but the evidence should still be there. Core sample holes, equipment marks, ventilation installations, and I have photographs of everything before they started removing equipment." "Good. We'll need you to guide us to the location. How soon can you be available?" "Whenever you need me. But there's something you should know. Roland Ashford knows I've been investigating. He's tried to buy me out, tried to intimidate me. If he realizes I've gone to federal authorities, he might try to destroy evidence or worse." Cho's expression had hardened. "We'll move fast. Can you give us a few hours to mobilize a team? We'll meet you at your property this afternoon." Mira had agreed and left the FBI office feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had federal backing, professional investigators, people with the authority and resources to see this through properly. But on the drive back to the cave house, her phone had rung. Unknown number. She'd answered cautiously. "Miss Delaney." Roland Ashford's voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk. I'm back at your property. There's been a development that changes everything. Call me immediately." The call had ended before she could respond. Mira's heart had started racing. He was at the property now, knew she'd been gone, was probably trying to figure out where she'd been and what she'd been doing. The FBI team wouldn't arrive for hours yet, and she'd be walking into a confrontation alone. But the cave house was her property, and she had a right to be there. More importantly, she couldn't let Roland remove evidence or do anything else to cover his tracks before the authorities arrived. Whatever he wanted to talk about, whatever development he was referring to, she needed to face it head-on. She'd stopped at a gas station and called the local sheriff's office, explaining that there was a trespasser at her property and she might need backup. The dispatcher had promised to send a deputy, though it would take 45 minutes to reach the remote location. 45 minutes. The FBI team would take 2 hours at least. Mira would be on her own for most of that time, dealing with a man who'd made it clear he wouldn't accept no for an answer, whose family had a history of eliminating problems through violence. She'd checked that her ranger knife was secure on her belt, made sure her phone was fully charged, and driven toward the mountains. The sun was past its peak, afternoon shadows stretching across the road. In a few hours, this would all be over, one way or another. The truth would finally come out. Justice would finally be served, and her father's 60-year-old murder would finally be acknowledged. She just had to survive long enough to see it happen. Mira arrived at the cave house to find multiple vehicles. Parked in the clearing, Roland's SUV and 2 work trucks. She could hear voices coming from near the cave entrance, see figures moving in the late afternoon shadows. She'd parked down the road and approached on foot, staying in the tree line where she could observe without being seen immediately. Roland was there with his workers, and they were loading equipment into the trucks with more urgency than organization. Boxes of drilling equipment, sample cases, portable generators, everything they'd been using for the illegal mining operation. They were clearing out, probably planning to claim they'd never been here if questioned. She'd stepped out of the trees into the clearing, and the activity had stopped. All 3 men had turned to look at her, surprise and calculation on their faces. "You're not taking anything," Mira had said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "This is my property, and everything on it stays here until the authorities arrive." Roland had set down the box he'd been carrying, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder. "Miss Delaney, I told you we needed to talk. This is private property, yes, but you're interfering with a legal salvage operation. Salvage of equipment you illegally installed on my land. I don't think that's how it works." One of the workers, a heavy-set man with a graying beard, had spoken up. "Roland, if the cops are coming, I'm out. You didn't say anything about federal charges when you hired us." "Shut up and keep loading," Roland had snapped, then turned back to Mira. "You've made a serious mistake. I tried to be reasonable, tried to offer you fair compensation. But you insisted on making this difficult. Your grandfather murdered my father. There's no compensation for that. You can't prove anything. Your father disappeared in the wilderness 60 years ago. People die in these mountains all the time. Accidents happen. It wasn't an accident. I have his letter, written the day he died, explaining exactly what your grandfather did. I have Ashford's written bribery attempt. I have Silas Kern's statement about being threatened. I have everything I need to prove premeditated murder and conspiracy." Roland had gone very still. "Impossible. Those documents were destroyed. My father made 3 copies. You found 1, maybe 2. But the 3rd was with someone your grandfather never knew about, someone who kept it safe for 60 years. And this morning I turned everything over to the FBI." For the first time, Roland's composure had cracked completely. His face had flushed with anger, and he'd taken a step toward her. "You stupid woman! Do you have any idea what you've done? My family has built an empire over 3 generations. We have connections, resources, lawyers who can bury you in litigation for decades. I'm 61 years old. I've got time." Mira hadn't moved, hadn't shown the fear that was coiling in her chest. She'd dealt with angry men before, knew that showing weakness would only make things worse. "The FBI is on their way here now. They'll document your illegal mining operation, seize your equipment as evidence, and start investigating your family's entire business history. And when they're done, the Ashford name will be associated with murder and fraud instead of mineral rights." Roland had pulled out his phone, making a call. His back was turned, voice low, but Mira could hear fragments. Need you here now, and situation critical, and whatever it takes. When he'd turned back, his expression was cold. Here's what's going to happen. My workers are going to finish loading this equipment and leave. You're going to stay here quietly until they're gone. And then you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about what happens next. The sheriff is already on his way. And the FBI will be here within 2 hours. You don't have time to do whatever you're planning. 2 hours is plenty of time. Roland had nodded to his workers. Finish loading, quickly. The workers had resumed their activity, moving faster now, throwing equipment into trucks with less care. One of them, the heavy-set man, had kept glancing at Mira with something like sympathy or guilt in his expression. Mira had pulled out her phone, held it up so Roland could see. I've been recording this entire conversation. Admissible evidence of your illegal operation and your threats. You're making this worse for yourself with every word. Roland had moved toward her then, fast enough that she'd taken a step back. He'd grabbed for the phone, but she'd pulled it away, backing toward the tree line. The workers had stopped loading, watching the confrontation with uncomfortable expressions. "Give me that phone," Roland had demanded. "Come near me again and I'll use this knife on my belt. 30 years as a backcountry ranger. I know how to handle myself in a physical confrontation." They'd stood there in a tense standoff, shadows lengthening as the sun dropped toward the mountains. In the distance, Mira had heard the sound of a vehicle engine. Maybe the sheriff's deputy finally arriving. Roland had heard it too. His jaw had tightened, and he'd made a decision. Load everything now. We're leaving. The workers had thrown the last boxes into the trucks, scrambling with obvious relief to be getting away from the confrontation. They'd climbed into their vehicles and started the engines, but Roland hadn't moved. He'd stood there looking at Mira, and in his eyes she'd seen something that made her blood run cold. Not anger anymore, but calculation. The look of someone deciding whether eliminating a problem was worth the risk. "You should have taken the money," he'd said quietly. "Your father should have revised his report. Some battles aren't worth fighting." "My father thought otherwise. So do I." "Then you're both fools." The vehicle sound was getting closer, definitely approaching up the mountain road. Roland had finally moved toward his SUV, but slowly, as if he was still considering his options. He'd opened the door, then reached inside and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "You want the truth?" He'd walked back toward her, holding the ledger. "Here's the truth. My grandfather kept detailed records, payments, dates, transactions, everything he did to build this business. June 17th, 1964, payment for problem resolution, $5,000. June 23rd, payment for final closure, $3,000. He'd thrown the ledger at her feet. "The dates match your father's disappearance and Kern's death exactly. My grandfather was a murderer, and I've known for years. Found this after he died, read every entry, understood exactly what kind of man he was." Mira had picked up the ledger, opened it to the pages Roland had mentioned. The entries were there, just as he'd described. Proof of payment for murder, written in clean accounting language, filed away like any other business expense. She'd looked up at him. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it doesn't matter anymore. You've already destroyed everything. The FBI will find that ledger when they search my property, along with 100 other incriminating documents. The Ashford Empire ends today, and it's your fault." Sheriff's vehicle had come into view through the trees, lights flashing. Roland had climbed into his SUV and started the engine. But he'd rolled down the window, looked at her one last time. "I hope you think it was worth it." Then he'd driven away, his workers following, leaving Mira standing in the clearing with a leather-bound record of murder in her hands and the sound of approaching authority in the distance. The sheriff's deputy who'd emerged from the vehicle was an older man with a weathered face and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen most of what rural Montana could throw at him. His name was Burke, and he'd listened to Mira's explanation with increasing seriousness. "Ma'am, you're saying this Ashford fellow was running an illegal mining operation on your property?" I have photographs of everything before they removed the equipment. And more importantly, Mira had held up the ledger Roland had thrown at her feet. He just gave me his grandfather's personal accounting records. There are entries showing payments for murder, dated to match my father's disappearance and Silas Kern's death in 1964. Burke had examined the ledger carefully, his expression darkening as he'd read the relevant pages. This is evidence of historical homicide. I need to secure this and call in state investigators. The FBI is already on their way. I met with Agent Sarah Cho in Missoula this morning. She's bringing a team to document the mining operation and investigate federal crimes. Burke had nodded approvingly. You did the right thing, but I need to ask, do you have any fear for your immediate safety? This Ashford, is he likely to come back with violence in mind? Mira had considered the question. Roland's final words had sounded more like defeat than threat. I don't think so. He knows it's over. The FBI will find more evidence at his properties, and with this ledger, there's a clear connection to the 1964 murders. He was angry, but I think he's accepted that he's lost. Still, I'll stay here until the FBI arrives. Make sure nobody tries to interfere with the scene. They'd waited together as the afternoon faded toward evening. Burke had walked the perimeter of the property, documenting everything in his report. Mira had shown him the cave entrance, explained the extent of the mining operation that had been conducted without her knowledge or permission. The FBI team had arrived just as dusk was settling over the mountains. Agent Cho and 3 other agents, along with a forensic specialist and a photographer. They'd immediately begun documenting everything, taking samples from the cave walls, where drilling had occurred, photographing the setup, measuring distances and depths. Cho had joined Mira on the porch of the cave house while her team worked. This is more extensive than I expected. They've been working down there for months, probably started before you even bought the property. They knew I'd respond to that classified ad. Jim Talbot placed it, trying to get the property into my hands like my father wanted. But someone else must have been watching, waiting to see what would happen. As soon as I took ownership, they moved their operation underground, literally. Smart of you to document everything before approaching us. Without those photographs and the ledger, Ashford could have claimed this was all a misunderstanding. Cho had pulled out her phone, showing Mira a photograph. We executed a search warrant on Ashford Development Corporation offices 2 hours ago. Found extensive records of similar operations across 3 states, pattern of acquiring contested mineral rights through questionable means, then conducting illegal extraction while tying up legitimate owners in litigation. How many other families has he done this to? At least a dozen we've identified so far. Your case is unique because of the historical murders, but the pattern of fraud and intimidation is consistent. We'll be filing RICO charges. This is organized criminal enterprise, not just individual crimes. Mira had felt a weight settle in her chest, heavy but not unpleasant. Justice finally, after 60 years, not just for her father, but for others who'd been victims of the Ashford family's greed. One of the forensic agents had emerged from the cave carrying evidence bags. Agent Cho, you need to see this. We found a hidden chamber with additional documentation. Looks like the original surveyor left a complete record down there. They'd followed him back into the cave system, through the passages Mira now knew by heart, to the deepest chamber where she'd found her father's final letter. The agent had shown them where he'd discovered a waterproof container tucked behind a rock formation. Inside were more of her father's notes, additional photographs, and a reel of film. There's a film projector in one of our vehicles, Cho had said. We'll need to view this properly, but this could be crucial evidence. Back at the cave house, they'd set up the projector while night fell completely outside. The film was old, slightly degraded, but still watchable. It showed her father and Silas Kern at the cave entrance, both men looking directly at the camera with serious expressions. Her father's voice, preserved across 60 years, had filled the small room. This is Vincent Delaney, recording on June 15, 1964. I'm making this statement for the record, with Silas Kern as witness, to document what we've discovered here and what's been done to suppress that information. For the next 10 minutes, the film showed her father detailing everything: the mineral deposit, his honest assessment, Ashford's demands for falsification, the threats made against him and Kern, and their decision to document the truth regardless of the consequences. Kern had spoken too, his voice rough but determined. "I discovered these minerals on my claim, fair and square. Bitterroot Mineral wants to steal them, wants to force me to sign over my rights for nothing. They've threatened me, threatened my family. But I won't let them win through intimidation. This recording and all the documentation we've hidden will prove what really happened here, no matter what happens to us." The film ended with both men signing statements, holding them up to the camera so the signatures were clearly visible. Then her father had looked directly into the lens, and Mira could swear he was looking at her across the decades. "To whoever finds this, don't let them get away with it. The truth matters, even when it costs everything." The room had been silent when the film ended. Even the hardened FBI agents seemed moved by the courage of two men who'd known they were facing death but refused to compromise. Cho had spoken quietly. "This is one of the most complete historical murder cases I've ever seen. Your father documented everything perfectly. Between this, the ledger, and the physical evidence of the illegal mining operation, we have Ashford on multiple felony counts." "What happens now?" Mira had asked. "We finish processing this scene tonight, then execute additional warrants on Ashford properties in the morning. He'll be arrested on federal charges: conspiracy, fraud, illegal mining, probably racketeering. The historical murders will be referred to state prosecutors. Your father and Silas Kern will officially be recognized as homicide victims, not missing persons." Mira had nodded, feeling tears threatening. My father would be satisfied with that. He didn't care about revenge. He just wanted the truth acknowledged. "He raised a good daughter," Cho had said. "Not many people would have pursued this the way you did. Most would have taken the money and walked away. That's not who my father was. It's not who I am either." They'd worked through the night, documenting everything, collecting evidence, building a case that would finally bring justice after 60 years of cover-up. By dawn, the FBI team had what they needed, and Burke had arranged for a deputy to stay at the property until the investigation was complete. As the federal agents had packed up to leave, Cho had pulled Mira aside. "You should know, the mineral rights situation is complicated, but with the fraudulent transfer now documented, the property will likely be confirmed as fully yours. The minerals are worth millions, and modern extraction is feasible. You'll have decisions to make about what to do with them." Mira had looked out at the lake, peaceful in the early morning light, then back at the cave house her father had tried to give her 60 years ago. "I'll think about that later. Right now, I just want to know he's finally at peace. I think after today he will be," Cho had said. "We'll be in touch as the case progresses. You'll need to testify when this goes to trial. I'll be there." My father deserves that much. She'd watched the FBI vehicles drive away, leaving her alone at the cave house as the sun rose over the mountains. Alone but not lonely. Not anymore. The truth was out, justice was coming, and her father's sacrifice had finally been given meaning. After 60 years of silence, Vincent Delaney's voice had been heard. 3 months had passed since that night when the FBI had processed the cave house as a crime scene. 3 months since Roland Ashford had been arrested at his Helena office, charged with conspiracy, fraud, illegal mining operations and racketeering. 3 months since Mira's father and Silas Kern had been officially reclassified from missing persons to homicide victims. The cave house looked different now, though the changes were subtle. Mira had done some repairs, replaced rotted boards on the porch, installed better windows, added solar panels for reliable power. But she'd been careful to preserve the character of the place, the sense that it existed outside of time, connected to something deeper than modern convenience. The property deed situation had been resolved through the courts. The fraudulent mineral rights transfer from 1964 had been voided, and the trust her father had established, delayed for 60 years by murder and legal manipulation, had finally been executed. The property was fully hers, surface and mineral rights both. Agent Cho had been right about the value. Modern assay reports confirmed what her father had documented in 1964. Rare earth minerals worth millions, now extractable with current technology and safety protocols. Mining companies had approached her with offers, some of them generous, all of them eager to access the deposit. Mira had turned them all down. She'd made a different decision about the minerals, one she thought her father would have approved of. Working with environmental lawyers and geologists, she donated the mineral rights to a conservation trust with strict conditions. Any future extraction must use the safest possible methods, prioritize environmental protection, and dedicate profits to preserving other wilderness areas in Montana. The minerals would be valuable for generations. Let them fund something her father would have valued. The cave itself had been partially preserved as a historical site, though access was restricted. A small plaque had been mounted at the entrance, simple brass on stone. Vincent Delaney and Silas Kern, truth seekers. May their integrity be remembered. Jim Talbot had visited twice since the resolution, driven up by a nurse from the retirement community. He'd grown frailer over the months, but his eyes had been bright with satisfaction. "Vincent would be so proud of you," he'd said on his last visit, sitting on the porch while Mira made tea. 60 years I kept that promise, and you made it count. You kept him alive," Mira had told him. "Without you, without that envelope, the truth would have died with him. You're a hero too." Jim had waved that away with the modesty of his generation. "I just did what a friend should do." Your father was the brave one. The federal investigation into Ashford Development Corporation had uncovered a pattern of fraud spanning 3 decades. Roland faced trial in the spring on multiple counts, and prosecutors were confident of conviction. More importantly, 12 other families had come forward, victims of similar schemes across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Their cases were being reopened, their losses finally acknowledged. Some of them had reached out to Mira, sharing their own stories of intimidation and theft. She'd found an unexpected community among them, people who understood what it meant to fight for truth when the cost was high, who knew the weight of carrying grief for decades. While pretending everything was fine, Mira kept her father's compass on the mantel above the fireplace, along with the photograph of him and Kern at the cave entrance. The journal was in a protective case on the bookshelf, a record of one man's commitment to honesty in the face of deadly pressure. She'd read through it many times, learning not just about the survey work, but about who her father had been: meticulous, thoughtful, unwilling to compromise his principles, even when compromise would have been easier. She'd started writing his complete story, documenting everything that had happened from his final survey through her own investigation 60 years later. It would be published next year, she hoped, a book about integrity, about the cost of truth, about how courage sometimes meant making choices that wouldn't benefit you but might matter to someone in the future. The glacial lake remained pristine, its waters cold and clear. Mira swam there most mornings when weather allowed, letting the mountain cold wake her fully, remind her she was alive and free and home. The wilderness around the property teemed with life, deer visiting the lake at dawn, eagles hunting over the water, bears passing through on their way to better berry patches. One morning in early October, exploring a section of cave she hadn't investigated thoroughly before, Mira had found one final item her father had left behind, a small wooden box carefully carved with her name on the lid. Inside was a note in his handwriting, for Mira's future, and beneath it, a copy of the deed showing his original purchase of the property, his intention to give it to her. There was also a letter, different from the one she'd found in the deep chamber. This one had been written earlier, before he'd known how bad things would get, when he'd still had hope that everything might work out. "My dear little bear," it read, "I'm writing this on a beautiful May evening, sitting by the lake watching the sun set over the mountains. I've bought this property for you, for your future. Someday, when you're grown, I hope you'll come here and feel the peace I feel. These mountains have taught me many things: patience, humility, the value of silence. But most of all, they've taught me that some things endure beyond our brief lives. Stone and water, truth and integrity, love that extends beyond death. Whatever happens in this life, whatever choices I make, know that I make them thinking of you. I want you to grow up in a world where honesty matters, where people stand up for what's right even when it costs them. I want you to be strong and brave and curious about the world. I want you to love these mountains the way I do, to find peace in wilderness, to never stop seeking truth. I love you beyond measure, beyond words. You are my greatest achievement, my deepest joy. This place is my gift to you, not for its value, but for its beauty. May you always have a home in the mountains, a place where your soul can rest. Your father, who loves you always. Mira had sat in that cave with the letter in her hands and let herself cry, not from grief this time, but from something more complex. Gratitude that she'd had such a father, even briefly. Sorrow for all the years lost. Pride in what he'd stood for and what she'd been able to accomplish in his name. And finally, peace. She'd carried the box up to the cabin and placed it beside the compass on the mantel. The cave house was filled now with traces of her father, his tools, his writings, his final gifts. But it was also filled with her own life, her own choices, her own commitment to the principles he'd died defending. That evening, she'd stood at the cave entrance, watching sunset paint the lake gold and pink. The mountains rose around her, ancient and enduring, indifferent to human drama, but somehow containing all of it. Love and loss, courage and fear, life and death, and the meaning we make of both. She'd thought about the journey that had brought her here. From that $50 classified ad to this moment of completion and peace. Her father had set this all in motion 60 years ago, trusting that someday someone would follow the trail he'd left, would care enough to seek truth even when it was buried under decades of silence, that someone had been his daughter. The little bear who'd grown into a woman who understood that some battles are worth fighting, some truths are worth dying for, and some loves endure across any distance. I understand now. Dad, she'd whispered to the mountains, thank you for teaching me what really matters. Thank you for this gift. Thank you for being the kind of man worth remembering. The breeze moved through the pines, soft and steady, carrying the scent of water and stone. If she let herself believe, it almost sounded like a whisper, I'm proud of you, little bear. Mira had smiled then, a real smile, the kind that comes from deep satisfaction and hard-won peace. She turned back to the cabin, her home, her inheritance, her father's final act of love, and gone inside. Tomorrow she'd continue writing his story, document everything for the book. But tonight she'd sit by the fire and simply be grateful. Grateful for truth restored, justice served, and the knowledge that after 60 years of questions, she finally had her answers. The cave house stood solid against the mountain, a place of death transformed into a place of life, where a $50 purchase had bought something priceless: truth, justice, closure, and the understanding that integrity, once planted, grows across generations. Her father had lived for 24 hours after writing his final letter, had hidden evidence, made recordings, prepared for the truth to survive him. And it had. Against all odds, through all obstacles, the truth had endured until someone came looking for it. The mountains kept their secrets until the right person asked the right questions. Mira had been that person, and she'd found not just her father's fate, but her own purpose. In defending his memory, she discovered who she was meant to be. Outside, stars emerged one by one over the lake. Inside, firelight flickered across walls that had seen 60 years of silence finally broken. And somewhere in the space between past and present, memory and meaning, a father's love reached across time to touch his daughter's heart one final time.